I'm with Michael Emmanuel from Canada. Now, Michael, how long have you been here in the Holy Land?
All right. Well, I guess altogether about 2.5 years. I'm usually here during the school here, and then go home during the summers. Now that would be the ordinary way I do things. It's been awkward these last couple of years given the pandemic and COVID, all of that. But more or less, if you add it all up, I've been here about 2.5 years.
And what are you doing here in the Holy Land?
So I help at an evangelical school or an American school in Bethlehem called Bethlehem Evangelical Academy. I serve by teaching English, teaching Christian religion, philosophy, and history, basically the humanities courses in the high school, and also helping out with running morning assemblies for our high school and upper year students, giving devotionals and devotionals to our staff in the morning.
Why here? Did God call you to come here?
So that's an interesting story. Basically, when I had finished my undergraduate, I was thinking that I was going to go off to seminary, and I did a year at a seminary, McMaster Divinity College in Canada, with intentions to continue on at a seminary in the United States. I did it in Canada first because it was close to home, and I could just focus on learning the biblical languages, and it was a little bit more affordable, and I needed to raise money. After my first year at seminary, I still needed to raise a lot more money to go to the seminary in the States that I wanted to, Westminster in Philadelphia. And I got a call from my principal, the principal of the school I had gone to when I was in elementary and high school, and said, we need a grade 7 teacher. Do you think you would be interested? And I thought, yeah, sure, I'll give that a shot. I hadn't done a teaching degree or anything like that, but my pastor and the other friends and family really encouraged me. My pastor particularly saying, if you want to go into ministry, there's nothing like teaching children and teaching in a classroom to teach you patience, to teach you love for others, and just to teach what in a sense it can be like as a pastor over a church. So I did that for 1 year, and I really enjoyed it. I really fell in love with teaching, really fell in love with my students, and so I did it a second year. And during my second year, a pastor friend came and visited our church, and he knew who I was and asked what I was doing. I told him how I'm teaching, and he said, would you like to come and teach in Bethlehem? And, at first I was a little bit, I know that there's a Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He was from Michigan. There's probably some small town somewhere in the United States that's looking for teachers. And thank you, no, I'm perfectly fine where I am. But I clarified, so do you mean the real Bethlehem? And he said, yeah, the real Bethlehem. My son is a principal at a school out in Bethlehem. And then I was, whoa. The Holy Land had been somewhere that I think for many Christians is something I've always wanted to go and see and to experience. And so I had this great urging and this desire to go and do it. But I wanted to make sure that it was for the right reasons and that I wasn't just going to go teaching there because I wanted to see the Holy Land, but because there was a legitimate calling for me to come and that I would be serving in a real and tangible way. And so I took a month to talk with family, friends, pastors, elders to see what they thought. And overwhelmingly, it was just positive support and encouragement. You should take this opportunity. So what year was it? I think it would have been about 2018 or 2019. Can't remember the exact year. Over Christmas, I Skyped with my now principal, Jeff Pribble, at Bethlehem Evangelical Academy, and we talked about the school, we talked about their needs, and all these things were lining up, what particular skills and assets I had and what they needed. And so I sent in an application and then began the process of fundraising to come and serve at the school. So it was not something I had ever intended to do, not something I ever would have thought of doing, but I had intended to be going to seminary, and God brought me into education, and now he's brought me into teaching out here in Palestine and in the Holy Land. So, it just was a complete journey. Definitely, the Lord directed my steps. This was not my plan.
Were family and friends scared for you coming here because there is a political situation?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that. Now, thankfully, in my situation, my older brother, Joshua, he is serving in Nigeria. He's teaching in a seminary there and working in the inner city there. And, of course, I'm sure a lot of people know about Nigeria as a country that is racked with civil war and conflict. So even though people were nervous and family were nervous about me coming out here, thankfully, because he had already opened that door, they were a lot more like, well, it certainly isn't Nigeria. And of course, as it turns out, there's conflict here. And, we even saw some of that last year was it last summer with the Gaza war that came up. But it's certainly what we get in the news back home in Canada and in American places makes it seem, I think, like there's a lot more violence and than there often is on the ground. Like, I find it to be perfectly safe walking around Bethlehem or Beit or any of these areas, perfectly comfortable. In fact, sometimes even more comfortable walking around than I would in major Canadian cities like Toronto or something like that.
Is it different teaching here than it is in Canada?
So yeah, there are some differences. Now, mind you, when I was teaching in Canada, I was at a private Christian school, and so there were certain expectations in a private Christian, more conservative community than there might be at Canadian public schools. But overall, I think the differences are somewhat cultural and social. And one of the big differences is that, how do I put this sort of cultural difference? Well, in Canada, say, for example, children know to expect that they should not be just blurting out and speaking to their turn. They know the system of raising their hand and staying in their desk. And of course, as teachers, you always have difficulties with that. But it's the sort of the general expectation that schools have and that children there know, I stay in my desk and I raise my hand at an appropriate time. Here it's not like that, not in the least, And I remember in my first year, particularly when I was in lower grades, telling kids, sit in your desk. You can't just move your desk anywhere in the classroom. You can't be wandering around and jumping up and down, And this wasn't students who were discipline problems. These were just the regular average students. They were all doing this kind of thing, and they thought it was almost bizarre that I was requiring for them to sit down, stay in their seats, and to stay focused, And at first they thought it was just like these kids just are completely undisciplined. But then, when you have assemblies with just the teachers, or you have parent meetings, and you see that to some degree, I mean, at an adult level, but parents and teachers, full-grown adults are sort of acting in similar ways. You see, there's a cultural difference here where sitting and being quiet while one person is speaking is not as usual and it's not as normal here. So that has definitely made it an interesting to try and navigate that as a teacher. My sort of when I'm talking, no one else is talking, but also that, well, that's just not what they're used to. So in the older grades, it's a little bit easier. I'm very thankful I'm not in some of the elementary classes, especially the foreign teachers who come. God bless them. I don't know how they do it.
Do many of the kids want to know your opinion on the conflict?
So that's interesting, is that most kids don't seem to really want to know my opinion on that. Now, maybe it's because they tend to be used to foreigners, especially if they're evangelical foreigners, having an inherently a Christian Zionist approach. So maybe that's because they're not interested in hearing it, and they don't want to hear that from me. But really, I think it's a little bit, because this is sort of the conflict and the political struggle is a way of life that people have just gotten used to, and whether or not I had an opinion on it, I don't think they think it would matter. It's not going to change anything. So they haven't really asked me all that much about what I think about that or anything of that. I mean, they ask me all kinds of questions about everything. Just lately, the big question has been, do aliens exist? So they have no problem asking me about all of these things, but they never really have asked me too much about that or my opinion on that topic, which is just as well, because as my role as a teacher in the classroom, I don't particularly want to be giving my political opinions on these sorts of things, because especially I'm dealing with kids who although coming from a Christian background and a Christian tradition, don't really know the Bible well and don't really understand the gospel fully. And I don't want anything to distract from that. If I was to say something in my opinion that they strongly disagree on and that could cause a conflict between me and them, anything that's going to distract from me teaching them about the gospel, and then of course our other studies in history and English and all of that, I want to avoid that anyway. So I think even if they were to come and ask me about that, I would say, all right, well, maybe in a separate environment outside of school or at a private moment at a break, we can talk about a little bit about that, and I would be very guarded with what I would say. But overall, if I'm not going to answer that question in front of a class and risk putting at jeopardy what my testimony and witness to the gospel.
Are most of the children Christian students?
Yeah, I would say about 80% of our kids at Bethlehem Evangelical Academy come from a Christian background, and then 20% come from an Islamic background, something like that.
Now, you left recently because of your visa. Was it difficult to get back in again with all the corona restrictions? Yeah,
I mean, I think many people are discovering this, that traveling these days is next to an impossibility. I had taken the 2 shots for the purpose of being able to travel, because I knew that Israel was requiring having them both in order to enter the country. But it was still closed for a long period, a lot longer than we anticipated. Originally, I thought I was going to come back in about the end of August, so that would have been 2021. And then we learned that Israel had changed its opening dates, and it was, as governments and bureaucrats can often do, it was given an indefinite period before they were going to open up again. And so I had to make this decision towards the end of summer, because school is going to continue, and school wasn't going to stop. So either A, I just wasn't going to be teaching and leave my school scrambling at the beginning of a new school year to find someone who can cover a lot of their high school classes, or I would be teaching online in Canada, in which case I would be waking up at 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm not a morning person, even during the ordinary school hours. So 3 o'clock at 4 o'clock in the morning in the small apartment that I was living in with my mom and my sister, who would not be happy for me to get up in the morning and start blabbering to my students, wasn't going to be a really good option. So I talked with my administration at my school, and we decided on a plan that I moved out to Cyprus, which was open at that time. And thanks to friends and contacts that I've made here who knew people there, I was able to find a place in Paphos where I lived for basically 2 months and taught online there. I was in the same time zone, and frankly, I was in Cyprus, which is, a beautiful holiday destination for many people. So, I was enjoying the beach, enjoying the sun. Sometimes I felt a little bit guilty. I'd wake up in the morning, I'd give a few online lessons, and I'd say, all right, bye kids, you enjoy the rest of your day. I'm going down to the beach now to enjoy the rest of my day. So I guess, I did enjoy my time out in Cyprus, but I'm more glad to be back, because I did not find online education to be as fulfilling and as effective as actually in face-to-face education.
So COVID's been quite a challenge for you over the past few years, has it?
Yeah. It's been a roller coaster between, back in, 2020 when COVID first hit us here in March, and the announcement was made in Bethlehem, and then everything just shut down. No one knew what to expect then, and no one, had any plans in place. And so the first major series of lockdowns back in 2020, what did they last? Like a month or a month and a half, March into April. It was a little bit of a gong show where, all right, for the first week, everyone was just in shock. And then it's like, all right, this is going to be something a little bit more long-term. Let's figure out a system, and schedules were sent out. And kind of each teacher had to figure it out. And we all learned about Zoom, as everyone was learning about back then. And it was just kind of rolling with the punches, trial and error. And that first series of lockdowns, we got through some material, but it was not at all what any of us hoped or wished for. I remember seeing a funny meme or cartoon, and it's like your expectations for teaching online, how they begin, and you see this very detailed drawing of a horse with all of the muscles and then the hair beautifully drawn, and then as the picture extends, slowly it turned into a more cartoonish and basically drawn by like a 4-year-old with just little stick figures. Like, this is where it ended up being, and that exactly described what our first series of online lessons were. And then the following year, comes September of 2020, we knew that the possibility of lockdowns was very real, and so we had a little bit more plans in place, and we had schedules that were better suited to online teaching, where we dropped some of the unessential things and limited the number of classes so that kids aren't staring at a screen all day, and that we're not all stuck in a room staring at our Zoom all day. And it went better. But obviously the constant not knowing when a lockdown is going to hit, and not being able entirely to plan, is the lesson going to be in person or is the lesson going to be online, did cause some challenges, because of course there are just some lessons that you need to be there with your students to be doing it. And of course, like doing things like having discussions, in say in religion class or in the philosophy class I'm teaching, where a lot of it is based on, having discussions with your class, and Zoom is just... And these other things, I know that there are ways you can do it, but it's very difficult getting the kind of communication from non-verbal signals and just feeling the atmosphere of a room to have those sorts of discussions. So it's made it difficult for planning. We just actually did some online lessons just the other day, although I think that was more affected by the weather here in Bethlehem than necessarily because of the virus. But it has been a bit in a challenge. There's no doubt about that.
How did you become a Christian?
So my story isn't going to be your prototypical evangelical story. I'm not going to be able to give you a grand conversion story. There's no Paul on the road to Damascus, or Martin Luther suddenly being lightning around him and crying out to God. So no dramatic story like that. I come from a Reformed background, and so I was raised Christian. And basically, what I would answer to that question, first of all, is that since I have been aware of it, and since far back as my memory goes, I've always been a Christian. Now, let me be clear. I believe strongly that to become a Christian, you do need to be regenerated and born again. But I cannot tell you the moment in my life when it happened. My parents raised me a Christian, and as far as I know, I've always accepted it as the truth. Now, that being the case, there definitely have been moments in my life where, that faith has become more real for me, and it's been more developed. Sometimes, especially in the evangelical world, we talk about conversion as if it's one moment, where I think that conversion is, in a sense, is a continual process where some people have that very real moment where they can say, I was not a Christian and I became a Christian, but they can continue and have another sort of reconversion. Not that they now have finally become a Christian, but that the faith becomes more real for them and it develops. For instance, if you read Augustine's Confessions, he sort of has that, where he has a one conversion moment where he sort of accepts God and he accepts that the Bible may be true, and then another moment where he accepts Christ as his Savior, and then he continues to develop. And I would say that for me has been my story about coming to Christ. It was something I was raised in. When I was in high school, I remember being shown a video by a friend. It was a Paul Washer, if you've heard of him, a famous Baptist pastor from the States. And I think the video was called The Shocking Youth Message, where he's addressing a high school youth group audience at a convention or something like that. And he turns them to the passage at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, where Jesus says, "Many will come to me in that day and say, 'Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons in your name and prophesy in your name?' And then Christ will come to them and say, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" And the pastor, Paul Washer, basically points out, be warned. Don't think because you've been a member of a church. Don't think because you go to the youth group. Don't think because of all of these external factors that you know who Christ is. You need to have a personal relationship with him. You need to give your life over to him. You need to acknowledge him as Lord and Savior, and you need to turn away from a life of wickedness and a life of lawlessness. And I remember in high school watching that and not being particularly affected by that, and his words were very powerful. And I wouldn't say that at all was a conversion moment, but that definitely was a stepping stone in my walk with Christ to really understand the need to take it seriously, to make it personal, and to make sure that I was not someone who, in that day, he will say, "I never knew you."
With children you teach, do you see signs of hope for peace?
Oh, that's a tough question. One of the things actually that recently was a big prayer request amongst the foreign group at my school, the few Americans and others who are particularly at our school for the evangelical purpose, beyond just the regular purposes of teaching English and science and all of that, was that one difficulty that we've seen is we've been putting in this work. The school is now 6 years old. I've been here for now 2.5 years, so I've been for a little while. We haven't really seen, the sort of expressions of faith or conversion or revival that that we're constantly praying for and wishing for. And that's been one of the prayer requests that we've particularly had, is that we would start to see some of the fruit that we're working from. Now, one thing I will say is, although I haven't seen a huge, major, total shift in worldview in many of my students, is I do definitely have seen small signs of growth, even from little things to, having difficulty getting them to want to read Bible passages or to discuss things in a religion class or to discuss anything to do with Jesus, really, is that whether or not they're just tired of arguing with me about it or not, is that now we can have some of those discussions a little bit more freely. So when it comes to, do I see signs for hope and peace, that's one of these things. Right now, I see this as a season where you're planting seeds. That's a metaphor or analogy that you often find in the Gospels of, and Paul uses it, I think, in Corinthians, says one person planted the seeds, another watered, but it was God who will bring about the growth. And I see this as a season of laying seeds. And sometimes as a teacher, we have to see things like that, because I think we would get very depressed quickly if we didn't, because you can be in the trenches a long time and see nothing happening and be going, it was all for nothing. My prayer is, and my hope is, that these are things that in the future, maybe I won't be the one to see reactions from my students or anything, but maybe 10 years down the line, the students see things. And I think this just reflects a lot of us. We can recall times from when we were in high school or in elementary school where teachers taught us all kinds of lessons. At the time, we just rolled our eyes at, and here's another lecture. They're preaching at us again. And now we look back and they'd had some great wisdom, or they were really speaking the truth, or that they really truly deeply cared about me, and that's why they were telling me a lot of those things. And so I hope the same thing will be true in the life of my students. Of course, I hope to see conversions and revival now, but I trust and hope that God is faithful to His promises and that He will bring effect by His word. And if I'm planting now and another waters in the future, it will be God who brings about the growth.
What's your prayer for Bethlehem finally?
My prayer is for the Evangelical Church here. I think it's less than 1% in Bethlehem, and even less in all of Palestine. My prayer is for revival and for unity in the Evangelical churches. I know that even in the Bethlehem area, there's all kinds of little splinter groups, and there's even infighting amongst the different Evangelical groups, which is, you're pulling your hair out going, there's so few of us here. We don't have time to be fighting. We have such a greater mission. There is so much dead orthodoxy. There is, of course, other religions around. There is Islam, and then there's a growing New Age movement here in Bethlehem. There are so many spiritual dangers and spiritual attacks out there. We don't have the time to afford to be fighting over these things. So my prayer is for revival in the church, for a desire to read and to understand God's word, and for it not to be merely something cultural and traditional, which often happens in the traditional churches here, but particularly as evangelicals, that this unique identity would be something that we're passionate about and that brings unity between all the believers here in Bethlehem. One theologian that has often inspired me once said something like, it's not the masses of people that can change a culture, but it is a few people who stand unconditionally on their faith. And I think that if the Evangelical Church here could be that we could see real change in the community of Bethlehem.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for interviewing me, Paul.